It's now my pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Aislinn Sarnacki. She's a journalist, author of at least 3 books about hiking in Maine, dog lover, registered Maine guide, and star of Borealis. If you haven't seen it yet, you're missing something special. It's Maine Public's wonderful new show about the natural world. I had never met Aislinn until today, and yet I felt like she had taken me closer. I felt like she'd taken me on many wonderful outdoor adventures throughout this part of the world because of all the hikes she's gone on and all the ways she's helped others find their way out into the world. So I can only imagine how many people she has introduced to new heights and adventures. Aislinn even mentioned that some people worry that she might make some outdoor place too popular by writing about it. So for the time being, I've decided not to mention the secret island to which my wife and I like to hike. It can only be reached at a relatively low tide. We'll see about whether I'll ever tell you about that, Aislinn. But to make up for it, I promised to take her kayaking on the tidal Penobscot in the town where she grew up, Winterport, Maine. So for now, please join me in welcoming Aislinn to the meeting.
Everybody hear me all right? So, well, thank you all for coming. I'm really excited to be a part of this series. It made me think a little bit more about what it is I do with my career and kind of the purpose behind it when putting this presentation together. So it was really nice. So today I'm going to be talking about sharing the wilderness, because that is what I do essentially through my career. And I think it's been so lucky for that to be my goal in and out of every day, but also there's a balance there. So there's a balance between outdoor recreation and then the conservation side of things. So I am an outdoor writer, so what that means for me, at least, for over a decade, I've written for the Bangor Daily News and other publications like the Bangor Metro, local magazines, things like that. And I've been lucky. My beat, as we call it in the news industry, is the outdoors. So outdoor recreation, wildlife, anything to do with nature. And then when conservation happens, usually I'm the one to call. And I get to cover the not so fun things like ticks as well. So I am a tick expert at this point. And it's been a fun ride. I'm not quite sure how. I went to school here at University of Maine and then went right to the Bangor Daily News after that, and kind of wiggled my way into the outdoors section. And worked there full time for over 10 years. And now I continue to write a column for the outdoors section. And I'm doing other things as well. So I have a weekly column. All right, so throughout my job, I have gotten to meet so many cool people in the outdoor industry and really get a behind-the-scenes look at what happens day to day. So this here is a snowy owl release, and I talk really loudly.
No, it's okay.
Do you want me to quiet down?
No.
Okay. I project. I'm not used to having a microphone. So snowy owls came down to Maine. They come down from the Arctic in the winter, and sometimes we have more of them, sometimes we have less. And they tend to really like airports because it's open, like the tundra. And so what was happening here is this one had showed up at the Bangor airport, and they were relocating it to another cool spot for snowy owls, which is a blueberry barren, which we have a lot of as well. And so that's what's happening here is relocation. We just released it in a down east blueberry barren. And I got to get up close and personal. And being a reporter is really cool because I get this behind-the-scenes access to some places that people never get to go. So this is Avian Haven right here. It's a bird rehabilitation facility. they do not allow the public in because you want to have minimal kind of interaction with the wildlife that they get in. But I got to show up on a day when they had to do some procedures for birds and got to see it firsthand. And another cool experience of Puffin Islands. This is Petite Manan, also not a place where the public typically can go. And this view is actually from the lighthouse there looking down. And then I was lucky enough to show up as a reporter on a day that they call Christmas. It's in the middle of the summer, but it is the one day that they go out and they actually handle the puffins because they usually don't touch them. And so I got to hold a puffin. It was pretty cool. So all that to say, most people actually know me more for my hiking. So I, early on in my career, started producing a column as well as a video series about hikes all around Maine. And the idea behind that, they wanted me to produce videos because we were getting on this thing called the internet, and we needed content. But also, I chose hiking because it's so accessible. It's one of the most accessible sports in Maine. You don't need special equipment necessarily, and we have trails all over the state. I didn't realize, though, just how many trails we have until I started my column. And I said, I'm going to visit a trail every week, a different trail. How long is it going to take me? I mean, and it would take me the rest of my life. I'm never going to run out. So I didn't realize quite how many trails there were at the time. And I did that for a very, very long time, and I continue to visit trails for my column. So it's kind of a continual thing now. I don't do videos quite as much as I used to. But that whole process of my career, that chunk of it, got me thinking a little bit more about how I share the wilderness, but also kind of the questions, the ethical questions that come up. It's not so simple. My goal all along was to share the wilderness in a way so that people could go out and experience it themselves. There are so many trails, but most people don't know about all of them. And I wanted people to be able to get out there and enjoy what I've always enjoyed since I was a kid. I grew up in Winterport, Maine. I spent time out in the wilderness throughout my whole childhood, and I feel really, really comfortable in the Maine outdoors. But I know a lot of people who don't feel so comfortable just going out in the wilderness. And so that was always my goal. But then the other side of that is this whole concept of people overcrowding places, overcrowding trails, and kind of loving the wilderness to death is kind of a phrase that I've come across. And as a reporter, I've learned more and more about that. So I feel like I was maybe in the beginning a little naive about some of these issues, and then kind of built my knowledge over time by talking to outdoor professionals. One of the places where I learned a lot is I went to a workshop or summit just outside Baxter State Park, and a bunch of outdoor professionals came together for that. A lot of rangers and managers of properties, biologists, geologists, and they all gave talks throughout the summit. And a lot of them are addressing this issue of loving the wilderness to death. Is that what we're doing, especially in our national parks and some of our more popular state parks? And so this right here is Katahdin. And this is one of the places that they're concerned about. In Maine, we have a couple really popular spots. Katahdin is one of them. Fortunately, the way the park, Baxter State Park, is set up, it limits parking, it limits how many people are on the mountain in any given day, but still there's really high demand to hike Maine's tallest mountain. So during that summit, there was a lot of talk about how do we spread people out, spread people throughout the park. Baxter State Park has, I think, 220 miles of trails and so many peaks, beautiful peaks. And so what I see as my job as a journalist is to tell people about all the other places in Baxter, while also honoring the tallest mountain, Katahdin, because I do love it very much. My family actually hikes in Baxter and camps in Baxter once a year at least. It's a tradition. So this right here is Double Top, another awesome mountain in Baxter. This here is my aunt standing on South Turner, which is right beside Katahdin, and it's a much easier hike and has awesome views, obviously. This here's OJI, one of those lesser known peaks in Baxter State Park. It's really easy to get to the trailhead. Beautiful. This is Traveler Mountain up in the north end of the park, which is a lot quieter. And this was during fall foliage season, which is really great. Also, if you do the whole loop, it's just about as challenging as Katahdin, or some say more challenging because there's so many peaks. It gets frustrating. And this here is a barred owl from Horse Mountain, which is a smaller mountain in Baxter State Park. And so I like to, throughout my travels and explorations, I like to share all the little things that I find along the way as well. So things like wildlife. I've gotten more into photography over the years to try to share not only through words, but through photos. And I've really, really enjoyed that. And here is the iconic moose, also in Baxter State Park. This year, I was just paddling around Daisy Pond with my my niece, actually, and we saw this moose. So there's all sorts of things to do in some of our favorite places, and my goal is to get people spread out and doing things also that are within their abilities and within what's going to make them happy. So maybe paddling on a pond is more your speed than hiking up a mile high. In another place, I don't know if any of you recognize this, another place that is really popular is Cadillac Mountain. So I live closer to Acadia National Park, really accessible to me, and so I write about Acadia a lot. And I'm always thinking as a journalist, how do I write about Acadia, but not add to the overcrowding? There's a lot of problems happening because of overcrowding that they're trying to mitigate. This particular picture came from a sunrise hike that I was guiding at the time, because I'm also a registered Maine guide. And so what I do when it comes to Acadia is sometimes I try to write about it in a way that gets people, again, spread out, but also visiting during other seasons. So this is the time of year that I very much encourage you in November, December to go visit Acadia. That's when the crowds are gone, and it's really, really enjoyable. So I do a lot of writing about Acadia in the wintertime, because that is a time that they could use some more visitors. And it's absolutely gorgeous. But the other thing that I have to think about, so that leads another question for me as a journalist: what's my responsibility when it comes to safety as well? So in trying to get people outdoors, I have to think about, am I educating them enough? What's my role in educating them to make sure they stay safe? And especially if I'm telling them to go hike in the wintertime. So you'll notice a lot of times I write about things like what's the proper gear, even really specific things like how to pick out ice cleats, and those types of safety messages I also try to weave throughout my writing. And that's been important through my columns, but also through social media. So all these things, I think people don't realize that maybe journalists sometimes have to do, or should do, if they're writing about a topic, especially if they're becoming an expert on a topic. These thoughts come up. So all this has led to me writing some books. So Down East Books reached out to me a few years into me writing about hikes. And so I've published a few hiking books, and that's been, it's been another great way to get the word out about various trails, and also, again, messages. So throughout the books, I have essays on leave no trace ethics, how to hike with your dog safely, because I often hike with my dog, There's a whole book on dog friendly hikes. And so that's been a big part of my career as well, is books, which has been, it's my favorite thing is learning from people that they've discovered a new place through one of my books. So that's been really great. And one thing that I have learned over the years is to look at trails differently and the wilderness and these conservation spaces differently, because of the people that put so much work into making them available to us. So I have done a number of stories on what it takes to maintain a trail. This right here is Rod Dobra, who brought me out on the Appalachian Trail. He's a volunteer, and there are people that maintain sections of the trail all the way through the state. And really, if you've ever been walking on trail, somebody maintains it, and usually it's a volunteer. And that means putting up signs, creating bridges, cutting back invasive plants, which I know is a big thing here in Orono. On the trails, they need to cut back invasive plants all the time. So that type of struggle. And I always think about that now, but I feel like when I first started hiking, I didn't have that perspective, that someone was out there maintaining the trails all the time. Fortunately, as a reporter, I've been able to go out and even help sometimes. So on this trip, I went out with the Maine Island Trail Association and helped pick up some islands, pick trash off the islands. And it's amazing what you would find out there, some of the stuff. We got a full porcelain toilet that we can bring back. So that was quite the experience, just seeing the work that goes in and the volunteers that are happy to do it. It's kind of uplifting, I would say. And then sometimes I'm not a part of it, and part of being a journalist is to be a fly on the wall and to just listen and learn. And so here we have two women who are planting native plants along a trail in Bangor. And I know at least one of them was from the Penobscot Nation, and so the plants they chose were ones that were important to their culture. And it was just a really memorable experience to me to join them in bringing plants back to the landscape, and for trail users to enjoy as well. I know some of them were high bush blueberry plants, so that was neat. And so again, I mentioned photography has become a big part of what I do. And one of my goals with photography is, I know that nowadays people have short attention spans a little bit, so maybe they might not always read my words. So this is another way to get messages across. And one thing I try to do is tell a story with my photos. And for instance, this recently, most recent column about butterflies, I actually just happened to stumble upon this. I was trying to take photos of monarch butterflies personally for myself, because my job kind of crosses over with my own interests. And I happened to stumble upon, at the Charlotte Rhodes Butterfly Garden on Mount Desert Island, there was a man there who helps maintain the gardens, and he was tagging butterflies that a woman had brought in from, she was out of state, and she had traveled with her butterflies to release them at this garden. And so I just stumbled upon a really cool story. I'd never seen them tag butterflies before. It's to track them for Monarch Watch, which is a program that's because monarchs have been declining, their population has been declining over the years due to deforestation, things like that. So they're being tracked. And so my goal was to take photos of the various parts of the process, between tagging, what they were raised in, what they were keeping the butterflies in, the garden itself, what that looked like, and all the plantings, which is absolutely gorgeous if you've never visited. And then the butterfly with the tag. I took so many photos of butterflies that day. But it was like, I was like a kid in a candy store. It was my favorite thing ever. So all these photos, some of them go into my columns and my stories that I write, and then a lot of them go on social media nowadays. Um, Social media, it's kind of it takes a lot of time, but it's also really important for artists, writers to get their work out. So it's kind of a love-hate relationship, I feel like, for a lot of writers and artists. So I try to spend some time on there, but not too much time. And I'm most active on Instagram and Facebook because those are great places to share photos, which is what I like to do, and then links to my stories and things like that. So, but that raises a whole other question. How do you share the wilderness through social media responsibly? And I didn't even think of some of these questions until I'd been on social media for a while and they started cropping up. There's been a lot of debate on whether you should tag where things are when you post a photo. And again, it's that same question. Are you going to create a trend where too many people show up at one location, where we overcrowd a wilderness location? Because overcrowding can lead to things like erosion, trampling plants, scaring wildlife, littering, all of these issues that can sometimes close locations to us as well, or result in locations being closed. So I take it on a case-by-case basis because I'm so used to sharing locations to help people get out and explore for themselves. I often like to share the location, but I do think about it sometimes. So it depends on the case. For example, the most recent hike that I took that's up there at the top with my dog is Eagle Rock in Moosehead. To me, I don't think that's at a huge risk of being overcrowded right at this point. When I hiked it, there was no one else there. I didn't see anyone all day. So I didn't mind sharing that that's the location I was hiking in. And I do so after the fact for my own safety as well. But this little otter here, I heard through the grapevine of my wildlife photography friends that there were some otters hanging out in a certain pond. And I really wanted to see it. So I went and I found the otters and I took photos and then I posted the photos on social media and I decided not to reveal the location to everyone. And that was to protect the otters and what they were up to. Because they're not super common for people to see. And I know people would crowd that location because it was a pretty easy location to get to or to walk into. So I decided not to share that. But it's always just kind of like a case-by-case question that I have in my mind, whether or not to share. Like this, slime mold, I don't have a problem sharing with people where slime mold is because this is such a niche thing that most people don't care about. And that's another thing with social media. I do sometimes post things that I'm like, people are going to like this. I'm going to get a lot of likes and shares. But for the most part, I just post things that I really enjoy and try to really stay true to myself, which I think is important if you're using social media, is to stay genuine and true to yourself. So I post a lot more mushroom photos and slime photos and bugs and spiders that most people don't want to see, more than anybody asked for, I think. But I think it's cool. So, and I like to share all the little details of nature more so than locations. I've been trying to focus more on the details of nature that you can see all over Maine. And so it doesn't matter if you go in your backyard or if you travel to go to a trail or a park. These little wonders of nature are going to pop up all over the state. This, for instance, is a turtle, obviously, but that I found in the middle of the woods in Ellsworth while I was walking along a trail. And he was just like sitting there in the moss, which is kind of odd. Usually you see turtles by the water. So then that led me to do a bunch of reading on how far do turtles really walk? Was he okay? And then when I headed back down through the trail, he was gone. So I was like, okay. He's not like stranded in the middle of the woods. But these little things in nature that I don't know about you, but if you've ever seen something unusual and then gone and done a bunch of research and jumped down a rabbit hole, that's what I tend to do. And I like to photograph mushrooms all of the time. I don't know what it is. There is a group of people that this is like an illness that we have, and yeah, and I don't forage them really. I don't eat them a lot. I just like to photograph them. And my friends make fun of me a little bit when I'm hiking because I'm often on the ground taking photos of mushrooms. But it's something that I like to share. So I do. And it's nice because mushrooms are throughout Maine. So we're very fortunate that we have all these different cool little things in nature that we can enjoy, and mushrooms are one of them. So, together this talk, I was really thinking about what is my real goal? Because for me, it's always been important to have a career that is kind of almost my life purpose, like it is what I'm doing in life that gives me purpose. And one thing is to share the wilderness, but why? Why share the wilderness with people? Why try to get people outside? Why kick them out the door and lock it behind them? Why do that? For me, it's because the wilderness can bring so much to you for your well-being, your physical health, your mental health, your emotional health. I've experienced it firsthand, big time. And I'm actually working on a book right now all about that journey that I've been through personally when it comes to the wilderness and how it can literally save people. And I've heard it again and again when I've given talks. People come up to me and be like, yeah, this is what hiking has done for me. I picked up hiking and it has completely changed my life. Or I picked up birding, or just started going outside more. There's this thing that I learned about in the past few years that's kind of taken off called forest bathing. I don't know if anyone's heard of that. You don't actually bathe, you keep the clothes on, but you go out in the forest and you kind of bask in nature. And it doesn't necessarily even have to be a forest. It could be the desert. It can be the lakeside, a beautiful, field. But it's spending time outside, and there is some method to it. You can learn some methods of forest bathing, but it's mostly just wandering and staying present in the moment, looking at little bits of nature like that, mushroom or slime mold or turtle, staying with nature in that way. And it's supposed to be really healing in multiple ways. And there's actually been a bunch of studies mostly in Japan is where it came from. I'm going to mispronounce this, but it's Shinrin-yoku, I believe, in Japan. And there's all these studies about what it can do for you. And it's a lot of de-stressing, and helping with things like depression, anxiety, things that are rampant through our society today. And that's why I'm really passionate about nature and about forming those connections and feeling those connections. The other side of it is, if you look at it from a conservation perspective, people are what's conserving and saving the world because we're the ones that are destroying it. So we have to also conserve it. It's really up to us. And if you look at it at an individual level, it takes people who care, right? You have to, whether it's a nonprofit land trust, which there are 80 of, I think plus 80 in Maine, land trust saving properties, or it's people working at the state or the national level, they have to care. And in order to care about the wilderness, I think people need to spend time in it, fall in love with it, forge connections with it. So it really does start at that level, the individual having a connection with the wilderness. And I feel like today's society, it's so easy to break off from that connection. I know in high school and college, I didn't spend time in the wilderness the way I did as a kid and didn't love it in that same way. And then I came back to it through hiking. So yeah, that's why it's important to me. It's kind of those twofold things of, improving people's health. And then also it is something that can aid in conservation if people actually get out and care about the wilderness. So I did want to mention, I do have a couple projects going on. So Borealis, as was mentioned before, is a brand new outdoor show by Maine Public, and I'm the host. So that means you see me a lot on screen, and then I do some of the stories as well. So get out there and produce some of the stories. And then we have other amazing reporters producing stories and getting out there. It's a lot of fun, and it's a lot of getting into the science of wildlife, nature, and then outdoor recreation as well. So I did a story on mountain biking, rescuing baby seals, all sorts of stuff is in our first season. So check that out. You can access it a million different ways, but through the Maine Public website, but also through their YouTube page, everything's up as well. So check that out and give us feedback if you like it. And I also have a guiding company. So that's kind of my next step, is I'm sharing the wilderness through my writing, through my photography, but I also kind of wanted to be there sometimes when people are having this life-changing experience. And so I also wanted to maybe kind of hold people's hands at, if people who might not feel so comfortable getting out there. And so I've been just started a couple years ago guiding through Maine nature hikes, and that's been a really cool experience. Because in Maine, you actually have to be a registered Maine guide to guide certain activities in the wilderness legally. So I had to go through that whole process, which was a lot of fun. And you can also, all my stuff's there. If you want to check me out on Facebook, we have a really cool community that geek out about mushrooms and stuff all the time on Facebook, and then Instagram. And you can read me every week in the Bangor Daily News as well.
Soka is now joining us. Linda, welcome.
Can we all clap again for this just marvelous presentation? Really, really wonderful. Just so interesting. And part of what's really intriguing is people asked some questions, and there was such flow in your presentation that you answered the question without even knowing that the question had been asked. Like one of the questions was, have you ever thought about the Appalachian Trail? And then like 3 minutes later, you were talking about the Appalachian Trail. Another question is, how do you promote leave no trace practices in your writing and your work? And you answered, you may want to say more about that, but you answered that question. So one of the things that was just so wonderful is the flow in terms of your presentation. And do you want to say any more about how do you promote leave no trace practices through your writing and social media?
Sure. I don't know how this works. This is such cool technology going on right now. I try to weave it in throughout my writing. Leave no trace is a group of 7 principles, I believe. Basically, you want to leave the wilderness the way you found it or better, is the whole idea. And there's some education that comes with that. I think that sometimes we get angry at people because they go out there and they do something that seems disrespectful or is harmful to the environment, but a lot of it is just a lack of education. So as long as they're educated, so I try not to get too up in arms about that stuff, but instead try to spread education about it. And it's really, a lot of it's just demonstrating how to do it yourself. So whether you're on a hike, bringing a trash bag with you and picking up trash that you find along the way. I remember I did a whole story on, there was this trend called, is it plogging? It was jogging and picking up trash. And so I did a whole story on that, did a video of me like jogging and trying to like pick up trash. one of the things that I really struggle with, humans are weird and we like to put our mark on things. And so one thing I struggle with is people carving into trees, or graffiti, like spray painting things. I have seen that quite a bit in popular trails. And it is hard to get people to stop doing things like that. I remember once I did a story on a girl who, she maintained a campsite for, it was like a public campsite. It was free because so public lands campsites, like first come, first served, state-owned public lands campsites. They're awesome. But she was managing them. So she would go around and clean the privies, which is a big thing that you don't think about, but it has to be done. And then making sure the campsite's nice and clean. And she said the one weird thing people do is move fire rings. Like even if it's created by a group of rocks, people like to take rocks and put them somewhere else. And she was constantly moving the fire ring back to where she wanted it to be. So don't do that. I wanted to, put that message out there for her. Fire rings. But yeah, there's all these little leave no trace things that I try to address. I've written multiple stories about human waste, which can be fun because you can be clever with your wording. Remember I wrote a story called The Privy Problem, and it was about how the Appalachian Trail was, and they're still doing this, they're replacing outhouses all along the trail. It's very expensive, and if you think about it, they have to carry in all these supplies or helicopter them into these super remote places. But the Appalachian Trail is so popular now that we need really good, high quality privies that are also compostable and like sustainable. So it's this huge effort. They've got it all planned out, and it's a group of volunteers that put in so much hard work. If you ever want to help the Appalachian Trail Club, the Maine Appalachian Trail Club, do it. Like reach out to them because they need people to help them with things like this. But yeah, just writing stories about these issues one at a time, hopefully gets the education out. Yeah.
Great. Another question people had is, what is one thing you hope that people who are new to hiking and exploring the wilderness will take away from their experiences? So what's your hope that about what happens to them?
I just hope that the fear melts away and that there's a comfort that comes. Because for me, a lot of times when I talk to people who are new to hiking, some of the things they'll ask me is, are there dangerous animals out there? Or aren't you worried about this, or this? There's a little bit of fear there because if you don't spend time in the wilderness, there's this discomfort. Just like I feel uncomfortable in the middle of downtown New York. Like I'm not used to it, and and I think the more time you spend in a place, the more that fear melts away. And it's not that you don't want to be vigilant, you want to be prepared, and that's another part is being prepared so that fear can melt away. So having the right gear with you, knowing where you are, knowing how to navigate, always having a map with you, having those skills so that you can feel comfortable. I just want people to feel comfortable because for me, the wilderness feels like home. Like I step into a woods, I'm like, oh, I feel at home. I feel that stress go away. And I want that to be a feeling that other people can have. And I know it just takes a little bit of learning. And the more that I spend time in the wilderness, I've noticed the more I learn about how to identify trees and birds, and if I can recognize things and put a name to them and know kind of how they work, that makes me feel at home too. So it's a process. Yeah.
Thank you very much. You had the most beautiful photographs. I mean, they're really just, I bet people could spend hours and hours just looking at them. And some of them were about butterflies. And that's really interesting because there's a large project going on in the state of Maine now that is about youth education about the environment. And it's bringing together traditional indigenous knowledge and Western science. And it's called the Butterfly Project. So it's really, really interesting.
It's funny, as a journalist, you learn about all these like random things, which makes me a pretty good dinner guest, I think. But like, if someone were to ask me about monarchs, I can tell you like about their amazing life cycle, which is so unusual and cool because I've written about monarchs so many times. I wrote a story about this woman whose farm was taken over by monarchs one year. She had a bunch of milkweed, which is the plant that they are exclusively will eat as caterpillars. But sometimes you have a bunch of milkweed and they just don't show up. And she kind of did that. Like she just kind of waited and waited year after year for these monarchs to show up. And then one year she just had hundreds of them. And she invited me to her farm and she's like, watch where you step because you will step on them. They were everywhere. They were covering her house. Like it was absolutely beautiful. So I learned so much about monarchs in that story, and I'll never forget that story. But I didn't realize going into it that they have multiple generations throughout the summer. And then the last generation is like the beefed up, like strong monarch, and it flies to Mexico, overwinters, flies all the way back. And then they have a bunch of generations that are kind of like weaker monarchs almost, like they're not going to do the flight, so they don't have to be as like hardy. And then the last one goes down, and I just thought it was so cool. But anyway, yeah.
Oh, that's really really wonderful. There were many central points to your delightful talk, but one of them is that it's really important to find ways for people to get out in nature, for people to feel, comfortable in nature. And I wanted to describe just a quick little story and get your thoughts about it. So when I was in Massachusetts working with new immigrants with Cambodian youth, and we had an environmental program, and we went up to another state for the weekend to experience the nature, and we had made reservations to stay there and things, and the owners would not let the young people in. They said, you're not the kind of people we want on our land. Have you ever seen that kind of sort of pushback in terms of the diversity of America and how important it all is and what we might do about that?
Yeah, I haven't experienced a lot of that firsthand, but accessibility to the wilderness, that is really important to think about, that diversity. And so often, I don't know how to say this in a way that's
Oh, it's hard.
It is hard. It's just so often that outdoor culture has revolved around the white man. And whether it's like getting out to see the national parks, that sort of thing, and trying to diversify, whether it's getting women outdoors, people of color outdoors, and so Maine Public, actually, with the Borealis project, that is one of the, there's like 3 things we're trying to do. And one of the things is make the outdoors more accessible to all. And so we're really trying to tell those stories of people from all walks of life getting outdoors and how they can, and how we can make it more accessible. Because there are barriers to getting outdoors. There are a lot of barriers. Some of this stuff costs a lot of money to travel to these locations, to have that leisure where you have the time to get outdoors. You're not, busy working, trying to make ends meet. And yeah, all this fancy outdoor gear. And so making it more accessible through like gear hubs and programs that get people out at low cost to no cost. These are the things we're trying to sniff out and let people know about, and hopefully also boost so that more of this stuff happens. Yeah, and there's this really cool movement right now also to get more accessible trails out there, wheelchair accessible trails, which I love seeing that. Maine Trail Finder actually is I feel like they're kind of spearheading it. They're letting people know about it big time, and it's awesome. So, yeah.
This is just the most wonderful talk. And I bet, David, you've got a bunch of questions there in the room as well.
Good timing, Linda. Thank you. And thank you, Steve.
Yeah, I had a question about the kind of history of loving something to death? Because I've heard of it in the context of like out west and the don't doom the bloom whole thing.
Yep.
But I haven't really heard about it in the context of Maine before. Has that historically been a problem here, or is it kind of heading it off that we're trying to do?
A good question. I just from my experience in being in this industry for the time I have, I think it's starting to happen in Maine. I think, you know, we've been vacation land for a while. People come up from New England and stuff. And so but I mean, I guess right from the beginning, we tried to love Mount Desert Island to death. That happened pretty early on with the rusticators, people just kind of flooding Mount Desert Island. So it has happened in Maine a little bit. But yeah, out west, you hear about it more, like kind of these major national parks and these major landmarks. The lines to get in are ridiculous, you know, in certain times of year. But in Maine, I do know that Acadia has seen like a marked increase in visitation in recent years. In Baxter State Park, the same thing. Again, they have a pretty unique system though, so that keeps you don't really notice it as much in Baxter. But yeah, I do think it is happening more and more in Maine. Fortunately, there are so many places in Maine that don't get flooded. Like there's just so many trails in Maine. If you go right outside of Acadia, there's all these amazing trails in the down east area, like heading further east and north, that I'll go to, and I don't see other people there very often. So that's been kind of my goal, to get people out to those places. But again, it's tough because you tell people about those places and then the locals be like, please don't tell people. So it's tough. Yeah.
I don't think there's an easy answer to this question. But how do you balance the need to protect animals and protect wildlife and resources with the effective gatekeeping? For example, like I'm also a photographer, so I love going out photographing the snowies in the winter, and I'll post the pictures and I don't post the location. And I know you did the same with the otters, but it's something I've thought about a lot with someone who doesn't have access to the social networks to be able to talk about, like, where do the snowies go? Where do you see the otters? They may not have access to see and witness those wildlife, which could be transformative for them. So like, how do you balance that?
I know, it's so hard because if you think about it, there isn't an easy answer. Because you're right, it's about that social network and like being a part of the wildlife, like having friends that photograph wildlife and them telling you where things are. And I know it's been a problem on eBird, like people posting, they won't allow, they'll kind of go back and forth in allowing people to post locations of certain types of birds. They're like, we don't care about robins, but if you post about a snowy owl or, you know, or the great gray owl, I remember showed up in Suncays a few years ago, this giant great gray owl, and people were really excited, but then every wildlife photographer showed up and it became kind of an issue. The snowy owl is one of the problems is if enough people show up to a location, they don't know to be afraid of people, like they just don't, they're from the Arctic, like they don't even know what we are. So they'll just sit there, so you get these awesome photos of them. But people don't realize if they get too close, they scare all of the mice away and all of the things they're trying to hunt. And then they don't have enough food, and they really need that food. That's why they come down here, because they don't have enough food up there in the winter. So yeah, it's really tough. The whole gatekeeping concept, who gets to know about the trails, who gets to know about the owls? There isn't an easy answer. It's tough, yeah.
I think all the time with social media, we always see like the accomplishments in the outdoors, like the summits, the great trips completed. What's like the importance of like the trips where you have to turn around?
Yes, so I have written about that before because it is so important to know when you've reached your limit. There's 2 books that I've read, and it's a series. This sounds morbid, but Death on Katahdin and Death in Acadia National Park. And I've read through those books because they've warned me of all the different ways things can go wrong. and a lot of times it's when someone pushes themselves too far. And so I've written a few times about either times when I failed to even find the trailhead, which can be a struggle in Maine sometimes, or a time where I've had to turn around early. So this past summer, I actually had an experience where I was hiking in Acadia with my dog, and my dog overheated and was like, I was really concerned, and I was like, well, we're not going to finish this hike. We need to turn around. And I had to like kind of nurse her on the way down and stop multiple times. It was a really scary scenario, and she was fine. But I decided to write about it because I think if there's education in that, just knowing when to turn around, when to call it quits, when to not, when you don't get to the summit. We still had a good hike. It was a little scary at the end, but yeah, so I have written about that. I think it is important. And also, I've written about the importance of turnaround times, especially in the winter. So recently I went and did the Eagle Rock hike. I started kind of late in the day. It's a 3.7 mile trail, so that means a 7.4 mile hike. Not great at math, but I knew I would have to do have a turnaround time in order to get back to my car before dark. It was a trail I hadn't done before. I have a headlamp. You have to always have light, 2 different sources of light with you, just in case your headlamp fails. But I didn't really want to hike a trail I didn't know in the dark, so I was definitely I wanted to beat the sun. So I had a turnaround time, and I actually mentioned that in my article, my column, because I didn't want someone to go out there. That's like one of the hardest things in the winter is people get stuck in the dark, and I didn't want that to happen to someone. So yeah, it's things I try to sneak in my writing a lot. Safety aspect.
Have you ever had an experience where someone read one of your articles, went to one of your hikes and had a bad experience and then came back at you? And how did you deal with that? No,
that would be horrible. And it probably will happen sometime, because I can only do so much to prepare people, you know, especially per article. But I do understand that people do use them because I have arrived at a trailhead and seen my article like in their driver's side seat or whatever. So like, okay, so they're here, and I probably say hi to them while I'm out there. Or I've like recognized people on the trail, or they've recognized me and we've chatted. So I do know that it does happen. People do go out after they read it sometimes, but I haven't had anyone have a terrible experience that they've let me know about yet. I would love it for them to reach out and tell me if they did, though. Yeah, that's tough. I mean, I think about that sometimes because there are accidents that happen that I hear about. There's been a few deaths in Acadia, especially in the winter time, where people slip and fall. And it's just kind of that responsibility factor. Yeah, and I hike alone a lot. So I've had to write quite a few articles about how I stay safe while hiking alone, why I make that decision. And a lot of people disagree with me about that and are not cool with me hiking alone. So, yeah.
Yeah, you have nice presentation and you have done a great job that you are promoting winter hiking, snowshoeing. In this sort of climate, you know, we have problem of seasonality in hiking. You know, summer are more crowded and other season there are less. How do you see, is that social media can only do, or other media could help in promoting the hiking in other season, or to avoid that seasonality in the outdoor?
Yeah, how do I kind of, yes, so when I started the column, it was back 2010 or 11, and I started it in November, and I was not a winter hiker. I was the type of person that would like hike in the summer, in the fall. Everybody loves hiking through the colors, and I was not a real winter person, and then realized quickly that I needed to become one and get some snowshoes and get out there because I started my column in November. And so over the years, I have come to really enjoy winter hiking. It's funny because I'm the type of person that if I park at the grocery store and have to walk from the car to the grocery store, I run because I hate being out in the cold. So I'm the one running through parking lots all the time. But I am extremely comfortable hiking in the winter because you're wearing the right gear, you're prepared, you're like super warm. So most of the time you're too warm, you have to take off layers. There's been multiple times where I'm hiking in like a t-shirt and snow pants because you warm up when you're hiking. And I think people don't realize that. So I try to just kind of demonstrate that and get across how much fun it is to be out there in the winter. because no one likes to be cold, but you're not cold when you're hiking in the winter if you're prepared, have the right clothes on, and layer, things like that. So I do try to encourage people to get out in the winter, hopefully by making it seem more accessible. And it's so much less crowded in the winter. Things are still absolutely beautiful and beautiful in a totally different way. I remember last winter I hiked up Great Pond Mountain in Orland, which is a really popular hike in this area. Super popular in the summer. There's always people there, blueberries, and it's awesome. The winter, it looked like a completely different place. Like it looked like this winter wonderland. All the trees looked like marshmallows. It was so cool. And people were blown away by that on social media. They're like, where is this? This is so cool. I'm like, it's Great Pond Mountain right down the road. And I think that encouraged people to get out. And I hope it did, because seasonal depression is a real thing. People really struggle through the winter here in Maine. It's dark all the time. And if you're going to live in Maine, I encourage you to find something to do outside in the winter, because it makes you excited for winter too. And we've had not so much snow, I think, in some recent winters. So I actually picked up ice skating too, and that's been fun as well. Like skating on wild ice has been really cool. Yeah.
So I think I saved all my questions for later. But it's just been really fun to listen to the conversation.